what I'd like for you to do is, in that course that you taught last term, what cells in the 24 cell thing did you fill in? That is, if you look at that, which of those cells did you actually work on in your course? So that's the exercise I'd like for you to do as you come in. Which of these cells did you actually tackle? This is not a time for questions. This is a time for you to work. So this is the exercise that people are working on. If they need the cells, the so forth, I'll refresh the thing there. But so think of a course that you have taught, and then think of the cells in which you explicitly worked on learning outcomes. Not what you think you did, but which is the things that you actually did. This is just a time to work. We'll just do the best you can with what you have, and we'll talk about it. I know, but do the best you can. You want to see this slide? Do the best you can with what you think you were given instructions to do. Okay, what I'm curious about is, you want to go back to this one? What I'm curious about is, given what you produced, whether you checked boxes or things, what surprised you in terms of how much you did or how little you did? Yes, sir. Okay. So all you did was work on this box. Was that a surprise to you? Okay. Yes, sir.
The first shot was that a lot of my time in the semester got wasted. I felt again that in the process of understanding, far too much factual information needed to be collected and transmitted to students. So although I initiated their participation in collecting it, half of the semester was gone. That was my first shot.
Okay. Any other comments there? Yes, sir.
How do you exactly quantify creating of facts?
Creating facts is generally a research project, but sometimes, depending on the course, you may ask students to engage in a research project. It is not it's not untypical to have undergraduate research. In a first year or second year course, it's usually not something that you do. Yes, sir. Okay, so you hardly touch this kind of stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what you would look at. I mean, not what you hope to get done, but what was actually looked at. Yeah. Did you think you should get there? Okay. Yes, sir.
I didn't touch the last row.
This cognitive?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir. You had the students work on projects, so you could have looked at that. Okay. Good. Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, sir. So it's likely that if you didn't understand it, you didn't look for it. So on the other hand, faculty members are rarely aware of the tremendous metacognitive knowledge and skills that they apply when they do the work, and they oftentimes assume that the students are working at the same metacognitive level, and they're not. And that's where a challenge comes in, because when you're conveying to students about how to do something, you're focused on, I just want to get this stuff done, but so much of what I contribute is actually going on down here, but I never make that explicit to the students. You're always tested it. Whenever you're asking them to solve a problem, students cannot solve a problem. Almost always, students cannot solve a problem without engaging metacognitive knowledge and skills. But that's not something we typically make explicit to them because we're so focused on our subject content. So you have this nice little diagram here where there are some examples of learning outcomes in each of the 24 cells. So for example, for those metacognitive things, you could have, there's one that labels deconstruct one's biases. That would be an analyzed level at metacognitive. It's an example of one. It's not the only one, but that's an example. So this slide is in there. It's more for you to look back at and say, gee, there's a lot. It's not something that you can absorb and go, I got it all. So most people, when they write learning outcomes, typically focus on the lower two levels of Bloom's taxonomy. But they always talk about their course working at higher order thinking. And so that presents a cognitive disconnect. So we say that we're trying to get our students up here, but when we actually target our work, we're down here. Part of that is that faculty members have not had enough vocabulary to write learning outcomes at the higher cognitive levels because they typically just don't think of those kind of things. And that's one of the reasons I introduced Bloom's taxonomy, to increase the vocabulary that you have and realize you have a lot more choices when you write your learning outcomes. So I'd like for you to now look at this and to say, in your course planning for next semester, write at least one learning outcome and know which of the 24 cells it goes in. And if you finish one learning outcome and we haven't stopped, then write another one. But know what cell that you're putting it in. If we need to go back to the cells, I can do that. Like this? Yes. You haven't memorized that already? Surely we're at this remembering the fact level. Think about a course you'll be teaching and come up with at least one learning outcome and know what cell it goes in. So, we worked on that. This is the following. We're going to do what's referred to as a minute paper. This is not a time for creativity. This is a time to follow instructions. I find this is something that faculty don't do. So what I'd like for you to do is to take this piece of paper, turn it this way, this orientation. On the top of this side, write clear, the English word clear. I'll let you be creative. But it should be easy to read. Most things would be from left to right. And on the other side, I would like you to write the word muddy, M-U-D-D-Y. Again, you could write it vertically or horizontally. Most people would write it from left to right. On the clear side, I'd like for you to write down things about learning outcomes that are clear to you and helpful to you. On the muddy side, I'd like for you to write down things about learning outcomes that you go, gee, I wish this, I don't understand this. I wish this was clear. I don't know what to do with this. Anything that's muddy about learning outcomes, you would put on the muddy side. So I want to know what's clear to you about learning outcomes, and I want to know what remains for you that's muddy or unclear, or you would like further resolution and so forth. It is not legal on the muddy side for you to use the word metacognitive. Okay? The reason for that is we have a whole session tomorrow afternoon, so I'm thinking that metacognitive will be something that people write down because we actually haven't done much with it. So don't tell me that it's muddy with metacognitive because I know that that's where we are. So I'm interested in learning outcomes, not metacognition, because we're working on that tomorrow. Thank you. If you would take those sheets and just pass them to the person in front of you, and then eventually they'll work their way down to the front of the room, and I can pick them up and read them. Now, just so you know, in terms of planning, I'm approximately 20 minutes behind schedule, because that minute paper is a clue to me that I should have been at that minute paper at the end of the first 90-minute session. So I'm about 20 minutes behind schedule. So what I want you to do is I want you to think and say, let's suppose that in planning the course for the next semester, you had a complete set of learning outcomes written down for your course. They met all of the rules. They used the verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. You had apportioned them into one of the 24 cells and looked at them, and you thought that they were in good shape. So if you had that set of learning outcomes, how would it help you? So I would like you to take a minute and say, if I had the certain learning outcomes, then I'd like for you on a piece of paper to write down and say, how would it help me? Okay, if you do that for a minute, I'd like to know how having a set of learning outcomes for the course would help you. Yes, we write. Write down your thoughts. What I'd like for you then is to take your thoughts and find somebody to talk with. Now, some people in the room are perfectly situated so that they have somebody to talk to. Other people in the room are situated like they never wanted to talk to anybody ever again. And in those cases, I would encourage that person to move so that they have, believe me, conversation with somebody else is not as painful as you might think. So what I'd like for you to do is to reorient yourself, and I'd like for you to share your pieces of paper and say, gee, this is what that person wrote down, this is what I would write down, this is what I wrote down, what do I think about that? So talk with somebody about the things that you wrote down. Okay, if I could have your attention, please. So, what's an idea that you picked up that you thought was helpful from your colleague? Yes, sir. The reorient the offering? Okay. Reorient what is offered. What else did you find from your colleague that you thought was helpful in the conversation? Yes, sir.
My neighbor wanted to see a continuum between what she is teaching now and what she would like to teach in the next semester. I think that is very important for me to learn.
Okay. Continuum. Yes, sir. Okay. Project can be one way. So while you cannot ask for creativity in the exam, you can ask for creating in the exam. That's the best point. There's a difference between creativity and creating. Others? Yes? Okay. So thinking from the student's perspective, what am I going to be able to do? Yes, sir. Okay. We can focus. We give a focus to our course because we can decide what we need to do to achieve an outcome. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Okay. So it can help to focus our delivery. Yes, sir. Yes. Planning for evaluation well ahead of the course. Yes. Okay. Good. So I want to call your attention to a couple things. First, this activity that you engaged in is referred to as a minute paper. It is something that you can ask the students to routinely do at the end of every lecture period. That you can ask them to fill out a minute paper, and we'll talk more about this, but this is an example of a minute paper. They fill it out, you would look at it, and then you would use the results of the minute paper to come back and change what you do in the subsequent lecture. This is an example of what's referred to as think, pair, share. It's referred to that because the first thing that you did was think by writing down something individually. Then you talked to somebody about it, and then you shared. Okay, both minute papers and think, pair, share are activities you can do in any size class. Works with either one. It scales, those both scale enormously. For the think, pair, share exercise, just a minute. For the think, pair, share exercise, the most important thing when you're talking about a very large class is what you will do to direct the student's attention back to you. So, I can give you some ideas, but I can tell you that focus on one way that you will always use to get their student attention back to you, and you will find within 1 or 2 lectures, after you do several think, pair, shares, that the students have become very conditioned and they will return attention to you within a very short period of time if you're consistent in the mechanism you use to get their attention back. Third, with respect to a think, pair, share, always make the decision about how much time to spend on that exercise for you. So you notice I'm up here. If I'm asking you to think, I push a button on the thing, I only give you a minute. If I'm asking you to pair, I give you a minute. You can pick any time you want, but be sure to hold to that time, because that's one of the things that people talk about when using these activities is, I need to make sure I'm focused on the time. We'll have some way that you can focus on the time and restrict the time so that you only spend X amount of minutes on a think, pair, share activity, and that's all you're going to spend. You do not say, I'm going to wait until everybody's been called on and so forth. I got X number of minutes. That's how long I'm spending. Yes, sir.
You said the minute paper is scale.
Yes.
Now, are we supposed to read those 400 responses? How is that scale?
So, most people tell me that they can take the minute paper, and if I were here and I were walking back to my office, I can scan through these, and by the time I get back to my office, I will be done with them. Okay? You are not looking to do a full qualitative research project by typing every one of these down. You're looking for patterns. Do I see the same thing coming up time and again? I may skip 5 or 6 of them and move on. What I'm looking for is, did a number of people consistently say the same thing was muddy? Did a number of people say the same thing was clear? Okay, that worked. Several people said the same thing was muddy there. Where one person says it's muddy, I don't need to worry about that because I got a class of 500 people. I'm going to focus on what a lot of people said was muddy. I'm not going to focus on what just one. And I can often do that processing in the short amount of time it takes for me to walk from my class back to my office. So yes, it scales. Excuse me?
even distributing the slip would take 2 minutes.
So,
Classes students to be ready with the
so this is your classroom management piece. If you have a large class and you say, gee, this is going to happen, okay, I'm not going to tell you how to do that, but you need to come up with a strategy. So, for example, maybe at the beginning of the course, you equip everybody with 80 index cards. And you say, I always want you to bring an index card to class. As you file out of class, please leave your index card right here. No time is sucked out of, So, you can design a strategy, but the larger the class is, the more you're going to have to do that planning in advance. How you choose to do that, you are generally a lot more creative than I am.
But you think it's scalable?
Oh, no, I don't think it's scalable. I know it's scalable because people have reported lots of times that they've used it in lots of different size classes. So it's not a question of there are lots of examples. Minute paper is probably one of the most widely used tools in existence. I just wanted to make sure people had names attached to things, so when we talk about them, they have that. Okay? We did that part. So some other people, when we've done this before, report it helps them to design assignments. Somebody reported that. Design course structure helps them to do that. You create a measurement system in advance. It helps them when picking videos, or it helps them to decide how well the course succeeded. Which of the learning outcomes did I actually get done according to the student work? Which of the learning outcomes didn't work out as well as I thought I would? So many of the same things were echoed. So, in general, the instructors help prepare classroom material. They help focus. One of the biggest challenges for faculty members when they have this incredible amount of content, it helps them to focus, to create assignments, to create tests. So, we're going to give these set of learning outcomes to the students. What I'd like for you to do now is to say, if you gave a clear, explicit set of learning outcomes to the students and says, this is what we're going to work on in this term, how would it be helpful for the students? Take and write those ideas down about how it would be helpful to the students. Okay, if you turn to your neighbor and exchange ideas, try to get as many ideas from your neighbor as possible. Make sure you have an opportunity to share yours. Could I have your attention, please? So what things did you pick up from the conversation in terms of what would be helpful to the students? So I can't read your names, but there's a person in orange and a person with a striped shirt. Between the pair there, what did you come up with something that's helpful to students? Makes it easy for them to be prepared for the course and the evaluation. Yes, sir. Excuse me? You'll think it will help them solve problems. Good. Yes, sir. But help them to monitor their own progress, because they can continue to ask themselves the question, can I do this learning outcome? Yes or no? And that they can also see that they're making progress. Yesterday I was not able to do the learning outcome, or last week I was not able to, and now I am. And by the way, again, as we mentioned, that growing success of I couldn't and now I can is enormously motivating to students. Yes, sir. If you generate a set of learning incomes for the course, it's very helpful to the students to be able to look and say, gee, this is what the faculty member expects. How good am I compared to that set of expectations? Yes, sir. Clarity in terms of that helps enormously with mastery, because you go, this is what we're after. Yes, sir. Whether to take the course or not. Yep. Yes, sir.
To let the student to do time management.
May help them with time management? Yes. Same? Okay, good. Okay. By the way, I'm doing an awful job of modeling a think, pair, share when it comes to the last part. If you notice, I timed the conversation, I timed your thinking, I timed the conversation, but I am spending far more time in a think, pair, share getting your answers than you would in a normal class. Okay, and the reason is that I'm interested in what goes on and I've allocated the time to do that. Typically in a class, your think, pair, share would be shorter than I'm modeling for you. So, here are the kinds of things that that people have generated before that are helpful. It helps them to plan their study. It helps them to know what they should be studying for. It may even help them prepare for a lecture, knowing what's coming. More stuff. Generally, it helps the student focus, and it helps the student to be clear about this is what's expected of me. Okay? And that may help their decision about whether to take the course or not. Your inputs, when you want to compose a set of learning outcomes, you may want to look at examinations that you've given in the past. You go, oh, if that's what I was doing, you can then say, is that really what I was after or not? But examinations give you the best idea of what your learning outcomes really were, because those are the things that you tested. Sometimes universities have learning outcomes that they expect the faculty to work on as part of the course. Sometimes your individual programs, whether engineering or chemistry or biology, have outcomes. Your peers teaching the course can provide you ideas. Sometimes if your IIT Bombay is above accreditation, so that doesn't help them. And constant reference to Bloom's taxonomy in those 24 cells can help you look and say, gee, am I distributing my learning outcomes in a way that makes sense to me? Let's talk about using learning outcomes effectively. So in any kind of thing, this is the process that I think of when you're evaluating student learning. You first have to articulate envisioned student learning. This is where you're generating learning outcomes. After you've generated learning outcomes, you have to then say, what kind of assignments am I going to have where the students could show me those learning outcomes? Too often, I've seen faculty, they talk about learning outcomes, but they never figure out what the students are actually going to give them. Do that. If you have a learning outcome, there should be at least one task associated with that the student's going to do where they demonstrate the extent of their achievement. Hopefully you have more so they can practice. But what are they going to do? So you need to see the tasks that they're going to do. You need to design the process and instruments that you're going to use to evaluate those tasks. Why are these in orange? Excuse me? These are all things that you can do before the course. These are all, independent of the number of students enrolled and so forth, but you would do these in general before the course so that you're not trying to because you can, and that saves you from trying to make them up in the beginning. Then you have to actually assign the task, get the data, look at the results, and share the results back to students. Steps 4, 5, and 6 have to be done during the course. By the way, when I laid it out this way, 1, 2, and 3 work with any kind of enrollment. The biggest part is 4, 5, and 6 doesn't scale sometimes. 4, 5, and 6 are entirely dependent on enrollment. So when you're thinking about doing these things, you have to think about what kind of time I'll have available to do these things, and does that make sense in a class of 250 or 120 or whatever. These things are things done before class and don't depend on enrollment, but you got to design them with an idea of what your enrollment is, because you have to think about the time that it'll take to do these things. This will be a think, pair, share again. Let's suppose that I have a set of learning outcomes. What are you going to do with them? So I'd like for you to write down some ideas. What would you do with the set of learning outcomes? Not the benefits. What would you actually do with them? Okay, if you take a moment and share between the 2 of you or the 3 of you or whatever, share your ideas for what you would do with them. Okay, what do we have ideas about? What are you going to do with them? Yes. Check, plaid. Yes. Generate in-class problems to check the learning outcomes. Yes, sir. Give them feedback with respect to. Okay. So just to clarify, it is very useful when the students get feedback about how well they're doing on a learning outcome, rather than they get back a test that said you got 76 out of 152. But you go, oh, but look, in there I did this learning outcome well, I did this learning outcome well, I did this learning outcome well, I did this one poorly, I did this one poorly. Okay, I got a sense about, now I've got a way to organize this stuff rather than just looking at a single number. Other questions? Other ideas about what you would do with them? Yes, sir. Okay, what tools am I going to need in order to work on these learning outcomes? Yes, sir. So I'm going to need case studies and so forth to work on some of the learning outcomes so that I could give those to the students. Okay? Yes. You give them as a progress indicator so that you can imagine a set of learning outcomes. You got a bunch of students, and you go and say, okay, here we are in week 3, here we are in week 7. Check, check. Notice how many more checks each student has. Yep. Uh-huh. Yes, sir. Now I'm going to have a clearer idea about what kind of evaluation methods I'm going to need. Yes.
There's one problem, for example, how to make our campus life more eco-friendly. And that concrete problem energized the students in the rest of the half semester. So they knew that now they are talking about their own immediate environment.
Okay, so if I have a learning outcome and I'm able to associate that with a task which gets them to interact with their environment, then I'm working on a learning outcome, but I'm also doing something that influences the environment that they're responsible for. Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I don't know. Yes. Okay. So I wouldn't say I want them to set it, but so I would say, here are the learning outcomes. You need to give me a test question for each of these learning outcomes. So yeah, that does a number of things. One, it helps them to say, oh, gee, that's what that learning outcome is about. Two, if they generate a test question on their own, then they often are also generating in their own mind, would they be able to answer it? Oh, no, I wouldn't say they'd need to be able to answer it. I wouldn't say they need to be able to answer it, because if they couldn't answer it, then I'd say that's where they need to study.
But I can share the experience. The students are not forthcoming with this.
Sometimes they're not forthcoming with it. But if it's a great... Sometimes that's true, but oftentimes. But if you set it as an assignment and say, here are the course learning outcomes, unless there are 2 test questions per learning outcome, you will get a 0 on that assignment, and it'll be recorded as a 0. Sometimes they're a little more forthcoming about that. Any other things that you would do? Yes. Uh-huh. So the simplest thing that I can think of is you can either do a learning outcome or you can't. 1, 0. So for each of the learning outcomes, the student has either they got a 1 in the column or they got a 0 in the column. End of story. That's pretty easy to do per. Yes? So here are things that people came up with. So there are two things that I think that you should always do with learning outcomes that nobody mentioned. One, you should give the set of learning outcomes to students on the first day of class. And you should explain to them what the heck they are. Because most students are not used to receiving a set of learning outcomes and couldn't decode the information in there, and you probably have to help them. So, one, I would recommend that you always give the set of learning outcomes to the students at the beginning of the course and explain to them what they're looking at, because most of them won't know without your help. Two, sometime before the exam, maybe a week or two before the exam, you would say, if you have exams, these are the learning outcomes that will be covered on this exam. Of all of the learning outcomes, we're only shooting for these on that exam. Okay? Because in almost every case, you're going to design an exam with only a limited amount of learning outcomes. I don't see why you wouldn't tell the student in advance, this is all you're going to be held accountable for on this exam. So those are two things that I think you should do for the thing. The third thing I think you should do is in every lecture period, you should be clear about which learning outcome or which learning outcomes you're tackling in that lecture. What are we working on in this lecture? Okay, that's helpful for you because it helps you to design what will happen in that period. And it's helpful for the students because they say, oh, okay, this is what we're working on today. Okay, good. It should help me be able to do that. So I would do that. Here's kind of responses that people gave. Here's what I recommend. Yes, sir. I'm confused.
What I'm trying to say is that if I say that in this particular exam, I am going to check or evaluate this particular learning outcome.
Good.
But then after the exam, student will come back to me and say, okay, we have given this particular question, but this question is not fitting the learning outcome that we have mentioned here. And then
So then the student is either right or wrong.
yeah.
I don't see what the problem is. Students have been wrong before, and the Earth continues to rotate. So I mean, if the student is wrong, that's okay. If you were wrong, then you set the question badly, and it's usually not something you want to repeat.
Explaining that process with 50, 60 students might be difficult. I mean, often that at this when I have faced some open-ended questions that kind of discussion / argument with the students kind of goes on for 15, 20 minutes for each student.
So the student comes to you and says, Professor, this question didn't align with this learning outcome. I agree with you. I disagree with you. 30 seconds.
No, it is not.
Why? I don't see the 15-minute conversation.
No, if I go by that kind of binary, yes and no, then it's fine. But if I try to explain that why it gives it the learning outcome or not, then it goes into that.
Okay. Yeah, the student is giving you feedback. So, it seems to me that when a student says this learning outcome didn't fit with this question, you have an excellent chance to work on teaching the student. Why would you pass up that opportunity? You're treating it as an argument. Students always come and say to me, the thing, I got 5 points on this problem out of 20. I should get X. I should have gotten 11. That's a different conversation. But I've never had students question whether, maybe they will. I don't know. But most of the time, they're not concerned with whether it tested the learning outcome or not. They just want to add up some more points. By the way, I had a colleague, he tried this one time. So I don't know what scale you grade here on. A lot of people grade on a 100-point scale. Huh? No, on a test or whatever you grade on, no, exam. I mean, you add up points and so forth. I don't know what your total points are in a course, but some people grade on a 100-point scale. Some people grade on a 1,000-point scale. They add up, you have 3 exams, each 100 points adds up. They put in something else. So I had a faculty member that graded on a 1,000,000-point scale. It was wonderful. The student says, "Oh, I need more points, professor. Here, 5,000 points." Student walked out and said, "I got 5,000 points. Way!" It's a chance for students to work on ratios. I don't know what a point is, but when they get 5,000 of them, they think that's really good.
I guess the worry is, do I retain my authority or autonomy to go beyond what I may have said? Would be the major or main learning outcome?
So if you say these learning outcomes are going to be covered on the exam, you better stick to that set. That has nothing to do with autonomy or whatever. That has to do with keeping a promise.
So I have to keep my word.
Yes.
So I don't expect the student to think outside of those learning outcomes for that particular thing.
That's right. That's what the exam is about.
But my point was, even after speaking to that,
Yes?
the interpretation might be different. Might differ me and the student.
Yeah.
The way how the question fits the learning outcome or not.
Yes.
Now, after that, I
So-
obviously have a choice to say yes and no and just go to the final.
Okay.
If I do that, I can set the time.
Right.
But if I try to explain to the student why that question fits to
Okay.
the learning outcome, then that goes into...
No. So so you can give an explanation to the student, and you would, it depends. You could give an explanation to the student. You go and say, I am going to give you an explanation of why I think this question fits with the learning outcome. That is the end of the conversation. That's my judgment. It's not your judgment. You may disagree with me, but ultimately, I'll explain why I made the choice. Now, sometimes they point out to you and you made a mistake, in which case you go, oops, okay, I goofed. I don't want to do that again, but I goofed. But in general, you are not looking in general to start an argument with the student. You're envisioning a conversation that goes on and on for hours. That's up to you. If you want the conversation to go on for hours, you think it's a good conversation, it's helping the student, great. Most of the students, though, are not going to complain that it didn't meet a learning outcome. They're going to say, you didn't give me enough of what I'm supposed to get. And that's an entirely different conversation. I think you're anticipating an argument that is unlikely to occur. And I think if a student did come question, I would welcome that and you have a chance for clarification of your thinking and theirs. Again, at the bottom, I would not keep asking myself whether I covered the topics. Because you can cover topics as fast as you want to. The question is, what can the students do with the topics that you supposedly want them to think? And that's where you need to develop the effort. Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm.
And then the authority and the topic is like how to package it in whatever
So most faculty members, if let me suppose I'm teaching the subsequent course. They usually say, I want the student to know, I'll use your example. I want the student to know singular value decomposition. Great. You would walk into the student, this is silly, but you can walk into the student and says, here's singular value decomposition. Now, if the faculty member in the subsequent course says, did you know singular value decomposition? Then you did. The key question you have to ask the student, you have to ask the faculty member in the subsequent course is, what do you want them to be able to do with singular value decomposition coming in? It's not a question of whether the topic exists. It's a question of what do you want them to be able to do. 9 times out of 10, they will respond, I don't know, because they've never thought about that. Well, if you've spurred them to think, they will then say, I want them to be able to do X with that topic. And in most cases, you would then realize, oh, that's pretty simple. I can get to that. Even though it's in chapter 6 or whatever, I can get them to be able to do that thing that they want them to be able to do. But too often, what happens is they give you a long list of topics. The students should know all of these topics. And you look and you go, I can't get them there. But most of the time, they actually generate that list without thinking. And if you get them to the point where you say, what do you want the students to be able to do with these things? A lot of those topics drop off the list because they didn't really want them to be able to do anything with those topics. And you can very clearly then say, I've got to be able to get them to do X. And it's also helpful to the student. They know that this subsequent course is coming. And you say, you're likely taking this course and going to be taking course B. And in course B, they want you to be able to do this. So I'm going to work to see to help you try to get there. And they go, oh, thank you. Again, if you can get the people in the subsequent course to shift to a conversation about learning incomes instead of just topics, I think it would help you focus. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do we give the feedback and that's your final feedback on that learning outcome? How do you do that?
I don't know. But here, first, I said you have to do this. I didn't say you have to do this. I said you could do that. Then you said you should do this. I didn't say you should do this. I said it was a possibility. Okay? So you're trying I'm telling you what to do, and that's not the case. Third, if you say your exam is going to cover learning outcomes 1 through 7, then on the front of the exam, you could have learning outcomes 1 through 7. And you look at it, and I've graded this. This is the score on the exam. Look at it quickly. Could they do learning outcome 1? No. Could they do learning outcome 2? Check. Could they do learning outcome 3? I can mark those things, check, or ones or zeros very quickly looking at the exam once I've gone through it. And there's how they did on the learning outcome. One of the challenges that I've found is that we are so used to a system where we give problems and they work on the problems and we give them partial credit that they never actually can do anything. They always get, there's 5 20-point problems. They got 15 and 17 and 13. They never got one of those problems correct, and yet they ended up with a reasonable score. Now, in one case, that's good because students like reasonable scores, and you're very happy about that. On the other hand, they never actually solved any of those problems correctly. Now, I'm not saying that you should do this. I want to be clear about that for some people. But another way to organize things is I want you to be able to achieve this learning outcome. Here's a test question that attests whether you can achieve the learning outcome. I am going to give it to you. If you give me the correct answer, you can do the learning outcome. If you don't, then you can't. I've done a thing where I go, okay, here's a set of problems. If you pick one that enables you to get a learning outcome checked off, you work on it. If you give me the correct answer, you got it. If you didn't, I'll give it back to you and you can work on it again. That's easy to grade. And if they didn't get it right the first time and they can go back and get it right, knowing that the only feedback I gave them was, no, it's not the right answer. If they can go back and get it right, most of the time I'm happy that they got it right. That then saves me a bunch of stuff of giving partial credit. I think many times it negatively influences the motivation when students realize they can't do any of the problems all correctly. But on the other hand, they were never in a situation, they're used to situations where they work on problems and they don't get them right and they get partial credit and somehow they kind of happy with the partial credit and they decide, But you have to contrive a system where students can actually practice and get feedback on whether they did something correctly, and if they didn't, they get another chance to work on it. Huh? Learning outcome achieved, yes. Learning outcome not achieved, no, you didn't get that. That's simple. I give them same credit. I don't care what, do you care whether the guy wins Wimbledon the first time he plays or when the third time he plays? He's still a Wimbledon champion. I'm happy with that. Somehow we give points to people who get it right the first time. I'm thinking many of you did not get things right the first time many times in your life, and yet you're in pretty good shape. I know, this dawned on me so my background is in electrical engineering. Because I taught in an integrated curriculum at Rose-Hulman, I was challenged once to teach a statics course. Electrical engineers don't typically take statics courses, and I was supposed to teach a statics course. What the heck is a statics course? And but I was solving a statics problem, and I solved it, and I didn't get I checked the book, and I didn't get it right. And I went back, and I go, I got it right. I go, if a student can do that, if they just know that they got the wrong answer, and they go back and get it right, I'm pretty happy that they got this down pretty well. The fact that they didn't get it right the first time is not a major drawback to me. It seems to me. But we often don't construct our courses where students get multiple attempts at things to get it right, because somehow we're very focused on whether they get it right the first time. Yes, sir.
One point, I know not a clear, there seems to be a hierarchy of learning. I think we should start something like learning outcome off the failure of course or 2 years, and then kind of work backwards.
Okay.
And the highest level would kind of be determined by the kind of demand the society needs at a particular discipline. That's the way it is. And then come to a course level, to a lecture level.
So the question is a little tricky because you asked the word, is that the way we should think about it? And I have no idea how you should think about it. So most faculty members do not think about a curriculum level thing. I don't know how it works at IIT Bombay and it works in different departments, but my experience in working with different departments is some faculty members don't even know other courses that the students take exist. So it's very difficult for them to design learning outcomes curriculum-wide. Most faculty are typically focused on designing just the learning outcomes for their course. So I'm just thinking, initially try designing your learning outcomes for your course. Once you get skilled at that, If you want to think broader or whatever, then you're in a position to do that. But I would not try to think broadly to begin with, because you're trying to make a very complex problem. You're trying to be a novice working on a very complex problem. I would prefer that you focus on a much smaller scale problem initially. But I'm not telling you what you should do. Are you clear about that? Okay, good. No, that's good. Yes, sir.
So, quiz or an exam, could we ask the students to map? We could just tell them that this question map to this other thing. So they know they can self-assess.
Yeah, you could say, you could go back and say, this is what this question was. You could then attach a piece of paper back to the exam and say, problem 1 checked X learning outcome. Problem 2 checked Y learning outcome. And then you can say, okay, on your, look at your problem 1, 2, and 3 and see how well you're doing on the learning outcomes. You could do that. Yes, sir.
I think giving multiple chances that seems very we don't do that because maybe like but when you get feedback on whether the student has met the right at that time you do recommend like not by
So I would say that, you couldn't do it. I think it's a trickier question, and I think only the student can answer why they didn't do it. The only thing you can say is, this is what was expected for you to achieve the learning outcome, and you didn't show it to me. I don't think there's a why behind it that you have to get into.
Why would basically just explain give the answer?
Yeah. Yeah, but the learning outcome should be clear enough that both you and the student could agree on achievement of it or not. That's why, again, understand doesn't work. Because I say, you're supposed to understand it. And the student comes back, I did understand it. And you look at a 1 out of 20 and you're going, that doesn't look like understanding to me. But, the student goes, I understood it. I mean, neither of you, you don't have a basis for a conversation. But if the learning outcome is explicit enough, then both you and the student should be able to pretty easily decide whether the student got it or not.
One is about how to assess whether the person has learning outcomes. So you are in learning activity there is a kind of grid or table that this question is mapped, so they can map to which learning outcome. And depending on how students perform in that particular question, it gives some idea to what explain the particular learning outcome. So that could be just one way of understanding. First of all, to evaluate whether all learning outcomes are getting covered in the assessment program, and secondly, how students are performing on that particular question. And second point is maybe related to the question of people asking. We have a concept of the program outcomes. So learning outcomes will be at the course level or the physical process level. But broader to that is the concept of the program outcomes that basically the kind of graduate activities that every graduating student has to exhibit. So in a way, university follows the structure where all courses, how they are ultimately fitting into the program outcome, that structure is very clear. And then based on that, it is expected that we need to do the outcome evaluation of the program outcomes also. How a particular, if a student is working at learning outcome level, which is at course level, and which is ultimately at program level. So that is the kind of mapping that generally university applicates. Maybe not as
So I think this whole question of learning outcomes requires a shift in how you think about things. Because, if you think about learning outcomes as being achieved or not, and you think about learning outcomes as multiple opportunities to work on a learning outcome, that may change entirely how you approach a course. Now, I don't ask I'm not demanding that you should do this, but I do think the idea of learning outcomes can encourage you to think very differently about how you approach a course, in terms of what you're going to ask the students to do, in terms of how they're going to practice on things, in terms of how you're going to evaluate the achievement of learning outcomes, and so forth. So you are able to make better decisions about how far you want to move from what you're doing now to what you might do. But I would suggest that having a clear set of learning outcomes is going to be helpful to both you and the students, no matter how you choose to implement it. Yes? So, yes. So, let me tell you at one level, giving examples is very powerful because examples are concrete. So giving people examples is great. On another level, examples are really bad because they are concrete. And I have watched faculty members. Faculty members are enormously skilled. They will copy anything with their own little twist. And so I have found that every time I give people examples of a set, they decide that is an exemplar, not an example, but an exemplar, and they decide, I got to be like that. And that. So I would encourage you but I have found that if you think of a course that you actually teach, and you do a search on the internet for learning outcomes for that course, you'll find you'll find lots of examples. Now, one of the things that you'll have to do is to look at a set, and in many cases, you'll look at a set and you'll go, that's awful. First of all, you'll find some sets of learning outcomes that don't even meet our minimum requirements. Second of all, you go, oh, that's not, But you may find a set that looks really good. So I would encourage you to look at the things that are out there, but I would encourage you to use your own discernment about how you choose to use the information in forming your own learning outcomes. So it's great in terms of generating possibilities for you, but lots of the possibilities are going to be ones that I think you should throw away. This afternoon, I think we are scheduled. I will show you an assessment scheme, and it will not be something that you should do, but it will be an example of something that has been done, which I think has a lot of merit to it. Now, any scheme has advantages and disadvantages, and I have found that faculty are very skilled. I don't know if you've been in faculty meetings, but faculty meetings are enormously skilled at identifying a disadvantage. So I've seen lots of faculty meetings go the following. Faculty member says, we need an approach to address this situation on campus. Faculty member says, here's an approach. Faculty member goes, there's a drawback to that. And the tendency is, if there's a drawback to it, we should not do that. And then faculty member 2, I have an idea for addressing that. Faculty member, this has a drawback. Okay. What you don't realize is that any implementation scheme has drawbacks. There was a founding of the IIT Bombay. They decided to do it this way. If you were a faculty member back then in a faculty meeting, you would have said, that has a drawback. And IIT Bombay would have never been created because it has a drawback. Things have drawbacks, but they also have advantages. So schemes that I'm going to look at are not perfect, but they're intended to help you to see, okay, there are options that I hadn't maybe considered. And I'm going to suggest, the way this is laid out, I'm going to suggest to you that it's an option you probably haven't considered, just so that you realize that you can have an expanded scope of thinking. I would share Bloom's taxonomy with my students, and I would explain to them the different levels. So my experience with Bloom's taxonomy is I can explain it to students generally. They don't become experts in it in 10 minutes or whatever. But as I said, when I look and say, okay, if there's the Bloom's taxonomy up here at the creating and evaluating here, and I go, what do you get paid to do? They go, I get paid to do that. That's kind of where people get paid for. They look, people do not get paid for remembering facts except on Jeopardy or whatever. Okay. And then when they think, what have you been doing for most of your educational career, they realize they've been working down there. So to realize there are different cognitive levels helps them to begin to realize, oh, if I'm supposed to work on those different cognitive levels, then I should expect that things are going to look different than my original expectations. So I find that giving Bloom's taxonomy to the students helps in terms of realizing that the professor's not out dealing with trick questions or just kind of things that weren't like the homework. This question is actually asking me to work at this level. Oh, I've never tried working at that level. I've never actually studied for that. I have to think about how I'm going to prepare for that. So it helps them. I would share specific learning outcomes for each lecture. I've talked about this before. Oh, I'll give this example now. So we'll finish up this. This will get. This I drew from a colleague. He's now teaching mechanical engineering at Iowa State University. So he's teaching a course in mechanics of materials. So some of you will say, I don't know what that means. Some of you, but I think, so here's what the person did. He takes and says, here are all the kind of topics and groups them into 7 different topic areas. And then he goes through Bloom's taxonomy, but he has slightly different things for Bloom's taxonomy. But he decides I'm not going to keep track of 6 different levels. I'm going to take each of the pairs of levels and group them. I'm only going to have 3 levels. So I have the topic material over here. I have what I'm expecting to do in terms of cognitive level up there. And I now have a total of 21 learning outcomes for the course, all arranged in a nice kind of table. Okay, so if the student gets all 21 learning outcomes, they get an A. If they don't, if they get less than 21 learning outcomes, we have a grading scheme. But that's the learning outcomes for the course. Okay, he doesn't write them out, think by A. He organizes them in a table, which is, I think, a little easier for the students to grasp. Although he does, in this case, he makes a decision that I'm going to have the 3 different levels for each of the topic areas, which you don't always have to have. And
boxes are not filled up. This is all.
The boxes are not.
7 topics in the 3 levels.
Right. This is what.
More than that.
That's right. But each of the boxes would then be a learning outcome. So I got 21 learning outcomes. No, I got enough. I don't write out the learning outcome in each box. Wham. Right. So I think this is much clearer for students to get a hold of than writing out all 21 learning outcomes in a big list. I think this gives you a different organizational scheme. So this comes down to a fundamental difference. There's a fundamental difference between grading and evaluating achievement of learning outcomes. I don't think people realize this, but grades are singular. You get, I don't know what, I don't remember the Indian grading system or whatever, but, we start down here, good, but there's a universal scale. Learning outcomes, you see with the 21 learning outcomes, I got a possibility of getting 20, each of the 21 or not. Now, the student could fill in the learning outcomes. They could have some filled in that they got and some not. Now, at some point, though, so this provides a very clear picture of what the student has learned and what they haven't. But the university eventually requires that you turn in a grade for the course, which is only one-dimensional and gives you very little information about what the student could actually do or not. And so this is the scheme that Dr. Schwartz used to take this matrix and the achievement of the outcomes and come up with a grade. Well, once we have this thing filled out for a student, we look at this thing and filled out, and this is how we get the grade for the student. Now, you may disagree with this and say, well, no, they should, for an A, or they should have had this. That's okay. Then work out your own scheme. But you notice that once I'm down to an A, I can't tell you anything about the learning outcome. I just got a grade. So there's a very different thing between a grade and achievement of a set of learning outcomes or not. The achievement of setting learning outcomes gives you a much better picture to both you and the student of what the student can actually do. Once we're down to a grade, we lose a lot of that granularity. But that's how A scheme for setting up the learning outcomes, and then B, translating learning outcomes into a grade. Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you've got if you've got examinations and you have a design project, then you have an even more complicated situation, because they're going to show some learning outcomes on here and some learning outcomes on the design project. And it would be good to keep track of all of those things, but ultimately then you have to come up with a scheme that translates learning outcomes into a grade. And that's up to you. Again, you have to come up with that scheme. But I think this is a better scheme, personally, this is not what you think, that then, coming up with somehow adding, we get points. You get 95 points on this test, you get 77 points on this test, you get 80 points on this test, you get 90 points on the final. We add them all up, they somehow sum to a number, and we take this percentage and we turn that in magically into a grade. And I began, at some point you ought to ask yourselves, why did we think that that was a good idea? What's so magical about adding up a bunch of numbers and then deciding that a single number then can be translated into a grade? I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just going, why did we come up with that scheme? But this is just a different way of looking at the scheme there. Yes, sir? Yes.
Correctly, earlier we have said that none of the level is superior or inferior than the other.
Right.
But then when I am assessing, somehow I am giving level 3 is superior than the level 4.
Not saying it's superior, I'm just saying it counts more toward a grade of A. Those are different things.
I'm taking 4 numbers of achieved level 3, which is A.
Okay. Well, that's that grading scheme. You can come up with your own grading scheme. You go, if you get any level 3s, you get an F. Now, the other people may question the rationality of that grading scheme, but you certainly could come up with a grading scheme there if you're worried about, Yes, in terms of weighting on these things, this grading scheme does supply some value judgment to these levels, but that's in terms of the professor. It's not in terms of, Bloom's taxonomy didn't apply that valuing scheme. This professor applied that valuing scheme. Well, that professor, according to that professor, yeah, but that's that professor. Yes.
Scheme sort of implicit that if you get an A, then you certainly get a B, C, and D.
Yeah.
So you check those conditions as well.
Well, but
just
say all you need for A is 4 level 3s.
That's all.
That's it.
But they're not sure the computers at B.
Well, we're not sure that they got level 1s or level 2s. You're right. But this is this grading scheme. You could put on additional schemes. Yeah, that's his way of. Yeah. And I'm not, again, you'll say, faculty member in a faculty meeting, there's a drawback to that. Yes. In which case, no grading scheme would ever be adopted. You could add, if you were grading, you could add that. You could add that, but that's not what he did. Yes, sir. A half observation. Huh, that's going to be interesting.
I would like to interrupt. So I suppose there are people who are very good, perform very well on these terms,
I am not aware of a study that would answer the research question you've just posed. So, just, yeah, yeah. But I think at least with this scheme, the students are able to see what they're getting. Whereas with this scheme, they may not be, when they get the grade, well, what did I actually accomplish? But when you have addition, I mean, most of these levels, boxes were checked in either with homework, quizzes, or exams. Now, where you have design projects and they can earn other learning outcomes there, translating that whole set from learning outcomes from exams and design projects could get a lot more complicated. You have to think a little longer, harder about how you're gonna translate that into a grading thing. I apologize, I am 5 minutes over, so we're when do we start again? 2 o'clock. We will be back and resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you.